have with me Mark Jones, who's a political science professor at Rice. And I also have Andy Tees, who's a political science professor at Houston City University. I'm having a hard time, or college, I guess. I'm having a hard time remembering the new name.
We do too.
Yeah. Andy was the government relations director for the Houston Apartment Association for many years. He retired and then took this gig over at HCC. And he was one of my go-to guys. So I'm trying to figure out, I was a line bar, and I was trying to figure out who was going to win elections. Andy was one of the guys I would always call. Let me get your PowerPoint up here, Andy. Andy did us a big favor and put this together, so Mark and I didn't have to. So let's talk for a second about the election we just had. These are the turnout numbers. You can see these are really low numbers, as they always are, these kind of constitutional amendments. One sort of interesting thing is we normally have something going on in Houston around this time. So Houston typically sort of, punches above its weight in these constitutional amendments. But these were all fairly non-controversial this time. Everything passed by at least 55%, most of them by more than that. Anything surprise either one of you here that you saw in the constitutional election results?
Probably not too much, in the sense that, one of the things about constitutional amendments is to pass them out of the legislature requires a 2/3 vote in the House, a 2/3 vote in the Senate, and then a popular vote. So when they get out of the legislature, they already have some consensus behind them. That is, you can't be one party. Now everything is, the agenda is controlled by Republicans, so these are Republican bills that have some Democratic support. There also wasn't much in the way of a no campaign or people working against these, other than a few sort of slate cards that were distributed by some Democrats in Harris County and elsewhere. So overall, but you never know, because for a lot of voters, and perhaps sometimes a majority, the first time they see these constitutional amendments is when they're going to the polling place. And so if there's some language that strikes them as a little off, if there's keywords that they view negatively, you can see some propositions fail. But generally, going into these elections, unless you see a very devoted and concerted no campaign, the sort of default is that they're going to pass absent some type of outlier.
I have a theory. I have no data for this, but I have a theory that voters want to vote no on something. When Senator Bettencourt and his colleagues put 17 amendments up there, people don't want to be a rubber stamp. They want to find something they can be against. And I was trying to guess which one it's going to be. Last time it was the mandatory retirement age for judges. I'm like, get rid of those old guys. This time, I really thought it was going to be the tax exemption for animal feed. I thought, why do they get a tax break? I don't get a tax break. It turns out all 17 of them passed. The only two that were less than 60% were the one about no tax on securities, and then the one about giving a tax break to people who let the federal government put border stuff on their property abutting Mexico. And even those passed by a relatively healthy margin.
So if you're not familiar with this, we have this ridiculous Constitution in Texas. It's many, many pages. And again, this is all sort of the Reconstruction heritage that we have. And so, I don't know, there's hundreds of amendments, I guess, have been passed to it. And someday it'd be great to sort of clean all that up, but I don't know that we'll ever do it.
We would love to do that. One of the great Texas government textbooks that we use is one that Professor Jones wrote. And you'll notice in his textbook, in the American government textbook, the American Constitution is always an appendix, because it only takes like 7 or 8 pages. They never put the Texas Constitution as appendix, because you'd have to double the size of the book.
No, it is. Yeah, the Texas Constitution is the second longest in the country after Alabama, and actually it's rivaling Alabama. And as Bill mentioned, it goes back to the Constitution of 1876, which was a reaction to centralization under the Republican sort of carpetbaggers. And as a result, to change anything in our state, what most states can change via statute, we have to change via constitutional act.
So we're going to move on now to Congressional 18. This was Sheila Jackson Lee's district. Then Sylvester Tron had it for a short time, and after his death, we have a special election to elect somebody. Christian Menifee, who's our county attorney, came in first, and Amanda Edwards, who's been running for this seat for some time, came in second. They'll go to a runoff. Jelana Jones didn't make the runoff. I guess, first of all, Mark, your polling was almost exactly on target here, right? I mean, you were very close on this. I was surprised. I thought Jelana would do better. Was that just a money issue with her?
What is that? So we did, as Bill mentioned, with the hobby school, I do polling at the hobby school with Jim Granado or Renee Cross there. And our poll, we had Menifee winning by 4, and then Edwards in second, about 7 or 8 points ahead of John Jones. It came out that way. So I think it does allow us to say that our polling results probably are pretty indicative in terms of the crosstabs and such of the actual results. What we found was that Yolanda Jones had a very difficult time with white voters. That is, very few white voters in congressional who are likely to vote in Congressional District 18 were going to vote for Yolanda Jones. She pretty much matched Menifee and Edwards among black voters, who were the plurality group in that district, but white voters, at least in the current manifestation of it, are about a little shy of 40%, and she just did horribly, winning like 5 or 6% of the vote there. And she also did not raise any money. Now, part of that was that, she raised about $300,000, but that's not a lot of money compared to what Christian Menifee and Amanda Edwards were raising. Part of that was because she was somewhat constrained by the legislative special sessions, but part of it was also she just wasn't out there raising money. Now, of course, there's the note of Isaiah Martin, who did raise a lot of money. He raised close to $1 million, and probably when we see his final results, it'll be over $1 million. That's about $220 a vote if you're counting. That's a little illusory, though, because if you dig inside his campaign finance records, he was paying quite a bit of money for his fundraising. That is, he had to give, you'd have to calculate on the terms, but he was probably paying, 50 cents for every dollar, 60% for every dollar that he raised to people doing it for him.
Is there going to be a prediction about who will come out on top on this?
I would say Menifee has the advantage. I think one of the issues that anybody is going to have is that the runoff situation is so screwed up because the city of Houston runoff is going to be in December, but the congressional runoff can't be until February because of the overseas ballot rules, and it's going to be right before they have a Democratic primary for CD18, which is a completely different district with completely different candidates. So you're going to have a very small group of very confused voters. So I would say Menifee has the advantage, but there's a lot of variables.
Right. So in our polling, we had them evenly split. But I do agree that, Menifee, in terms of assuming that he retains the support of people like Commissioner Ellis and others, will have a little bit of benefit on the mobilization side. But this is an election that will be all about turnout. That is, which of these two candidates can get their voters to come out in this very confusing election that's smack dab in the start of primary season with completely different district boundaries, as Andy mentioned, and completely different candidates in those races. And to come out when that is the only thing on the ballot. So, in that sense, that's where, Amanda Edwards might have a small advantage there in terms of targeting the most motivated voters, but it's difficult. And then, the difficulty, and we're probably going to talk about redistricting in a little bit, but the dilemma that both Amanda Edwards and Christian Menifee face is that the filing deadline closes on December 8th. It's December 8th, might be the 7th. It's 30 days from today. Filing opened today, it closes in 30 days. They're going to have to decide where to file or if to file in the new Congressional District 18, which is really the old Congressional District 9, the new Congressional District 29, which is really mostly about half the current Congressional District 18, or decide not to run for re-election or do something else. But they're going to have to make that decision well before they're even participating in this runoff. And I think Yolanda Jones finished third. That was the best thing that could happen for her, because she was probably in a situation, at least in terms of our survey, where she was going to lose to either Menifee or Edwards in the runoff for sure, and it would have been far more complicated for her to run for re-election for her state house seat if she was simultaneously a congressional candidate. So that probably wasn't the worst thing in the world.
So Professor Jones will give you a pop quiz on what he just tried to tell you. But the bottom line here is that whoever takes this seat will probably be over 9 months and then out, right? Because This is Al Green's district, basically. So Al's not going to run in 9. He's going to run in 18. And he's an institution like me, and I don't see how any of these people beat Al Green.
No, I mean, I think it's impossible. Al Green, so the new District 18 is about 60% of the old District 9, which Al Green has represented for 20 years. He also, as Bill mentioned, is an institution. He would have the backing of, say, Commissioner Ellis, as well as many other elected officials. So, if I were Christian Menifee or Amanda Edwards and I wanted to run for re-election, I wouldn't run in 18. I would run against Sylvia Garcia in 29. The reason is the 29 is to be a Latino majority district in both spirit, both in numbers, but also in spirit. That is, an overwhelming majority of the people who actually voted in that election, especially in the consequential Democratic primary, were Latino, meaning that a Latino was likely to be the candidate of choice of Democratic primary voters, who then affected in that dark blue district determined who was elected. The new Congressional District 18, it's technically Latino plurality, but if you look at the people who will actually vote in the Democratic primary, it's plurality African American, meaning that a strong African American Democrat may have an advantage over a Latino Democrat. Now, Congresswoman Garcia also has been an elected official for some time, so she's not just your average candidate, so she may be able to pull it out. But this district is very similar to one that used to exist up in Dallas, that's represented by Mark Vesey right now, that had a Latino plurality, but consistently elected an African-American candidate because African-Americans outnumbered Latinos in the Democratic primary, which was the crucial district there. So, if you're Menifee or Edwards, that's one of your other options.
Okay, so the Houston City Council election, we had an at-large, we had an open seat. Letitia Plummer is going to go run for county judge, and so she resigned her seat. Dwight Boykins, a lot of you probably remember, was on city council for a long time. And Alejandra Salinas is a very bright, young Latino lawyer down at Sussman Godfrey. They basically came in at a virtual tie. Jordan Thomas was the young man that I mentioned when John was here, who ran specifically on the platform of standing up to the mayor and fighting him on the bike lanes and all that. You can see he didn't do all that well. I don't have any idea which one of these two people will win. It'll be a low turnout. Salinas will probably have the money, but Dwight has the name ID. So I kind of agree that as a toss-up. Y'all agree?
I would kind of agree. I think Boykins maybe has the opportunity with some money if he can ramp up his fundraising to sort of go take this, but I don't have a real strong feeling how it's going to go, Mark.
No, it's difficult. I mean, this is a citywide race. It's going to be, if not the only thing on the ballot, there may be one school board trustee election somewhere, but it's pretty much the only thing. So this will probably be one of those record low turnout elections where we're at 2, 3, 4% of registered voters making the choice, and it's one of those elections that will then renew calls for ranked choice voting. For some of these types of elections, ranked choice voting will allow you to sort of put your first place, second, third choice, and then it's effectively an instant runoff. There's some issues with ranked choice voting, but this would be probably an instance from a turnout perspective where it might have been preferable. Now, the downside to ranked choice voting, of course, is one advantage of the runoff is now for people who haven't been paying attention to this race, from the media to voters, now they'll be able to focus in on 2 candidates as opposed to 14. That is Boykins and Salinas. I think one other thing we saw here, I think Bill mentioned, we've seen several signals that Mayor Whitmire, despite a small vocal minority sometimes criticizing him for wanting to get rid of bike lanes that, say, aren't ever used. But what we see is that, there isn't much of an appetite among Houston voters to either recall the mayor, that failed dismally, or even to support a candidate who would be represent a strong opponent to the mayor in city council.
Yeah, it's funny, the bike lane deal has gotten so much attention, so much coverage in the Chronicle, and I've seen John's polling on this, and so here's what it says. If you're building bike lanes down on the bayou, bike paths and all that, people are in favor of that 70-80%. If you're building them on the street, nobody's in favor of it. That's just what the people say, because they don't want the bikes out there because it impedes traffic, and also it's just extremely dangerous to have bikes in the same areas as cars. So that group of young men that's all upset, that was really who did the recall petition. They can rail about it all they want, but the polling's been overwhelming. So you put the slide in about the Cy-Fair School Board race, which was unusual. We actually have a candidate here from that participated in this election. Can you tell me why you thought it was important to put this in?
Well, it got more attention than most school board races generally do. You had more outside attention, I guess, than you usually have with school board races. Governor Abbott, came in to make a plug for sort of the conservative slate. The Republican Party, in a nonpartisan race, came out and endorsed candidates. And the total vote in this race was, I think, like 7,000 votes, I think, higher than it had been the last time there was a Cy-Fair School Board race. So it got a lot of attention, and it is either an anomaly or it's a trend, but it's something that we saw in Katy ISD, where I live, that you're starting to see something of a backlash against the, I hate to use conservative and liberal because I think it's more than that, but the flavor of conservatism that's more, I guess, less education focused. I don't know, I'm going to get in trouble talking about it this way. Maybe a little bit less education focused and a little bit more culturally focused. Would that be a fair way to say it? And you're starting to see, I think, maybe a little bit of pushback, not just from progressive voters, but from, I would say, sort of more moderate mainstream voters that really would like to sort of get away from, book banning and gay bashing and, a little bit more toward education-focused kind of stuff. Now, we'll see what happens, going forward. As I think, as it was actually Professor Rottenhouse mentioned, we're still going to see, a huge cultural conservative influence in school board elections, but I don't know that it's as unchecked as maybe it was more than, a year or two ago.
Okay, so we'll have to watch that. You'll have to keep us up to speed about what's going on out there. This was the one that I was just dumbfounded by. This was what we've talked about a couple of times, the Proposition Q up in Austin. This was to dramatically raise property taxes in the city of Austin, and it got just trashed down 2-1. I said earlier that, Whitmire's been under a lot of pressure from a few city council members and from the Chronicle especially about thinking property taxes ought to be raised. He said he's not going to do that until he exhausts every other possibility, which I think kind of makes sense. And I've seen some polling on this in Houston, and these numbers are validated by the polling I've seen on it. Either one of y'all have an opinion about if we actually had this kind of election in Houston, how it would come out?
I think it would come out a lot the same. I think property taxes have just gone up so much, so fast for so many people. I will say in Austin, on the one hand, it's a much more progressive electorate than Houston's electorate is, but on the other hand, I think they suffered from some optics problems that Houston isn't. But Mayor Whitmire, I think, for the most part, has been pretty popular and has been, supported by a pretty wide, share of Houston's voters. Austin, and this didn't make a lot of news outside of the city of Austin, but like just recently, they spent something well over $1 million on consultants redesigning their city logo. You don't want to do that and then go ask voters to raise their own property taxes. That's a bad look. So I think if we could avoid something like that, Houston might have a little better shot. But still, asking people to raise their property taxes at a time when property taxes, are at historic highs, and when, the main statistic for me is the rate, and I know Senator Betancourt always, has like a slide on this when they talk about property taxes. If you look at the rate at which government revenue is increasing versus the rate at which people's incomes are increasing, and the gap is pretty significant, and that's just not sustainable.
Yeah, I've done a chart where I've looked at wage growth versus property tax receipt growth, and one's about 2 or 3 times higher than the other. Have you ever polled this before, the property tax stuff?
Yeah, we polled on property tax. We were focused on Harris County, and there was opposition to it. I mean, so there's a majority opposition to it. You really, I think, to pass these types of taxes, you have to make a very compelling case, and there has to be a real demand for it. I think one of the reasons why Proposition Q failed so badly is the Austin City Council, other than saying they wanted to do all these new things from the homeless population and others, didn't have a compelling argument for how it would benefit the lives of the majority of voters. And they were, I think Andy sort of alluded to this, they were sort of really hurt by a lot of, really some good coverage by the Austin American Statesman and others, and in the No campaign, highlighting all of the things that they were already spending lots of money on, from logo change, but also they have a whole cottage industry of nonprofits that are making a considerable amount of money from Austin tax revenue. And I think those stories, plus some trips to, ill-timed trips to France and ill-timed hiring of leadership coaches,
Seemed like didn't I hear somebody else going to France here not too long ago?
Well, France is popular for.
Yeah, I mean, I think, my impression is that Whitmire's trying to make a case that he's going to need more revenue down the road someplace, but he wants to make the case he's done everything possible before he asked to do that. That, at least to me, is a logical way to approach it.
Right. Whitmire has the ability to say, I didn't want to raise taxes, but I've done everything possible. We still have this need. And then that's a compelling case. It's tough to make the argument. You can't say that the first thing he came in and said, I want to raise taxes. He's done the exact opposite against quite a bit of pressure. That is, he takes a lot of heat from a small vocal progressive wing of the citizenry to try to increase spending.
It's amazing what 50 years in politics will give you, the experience will give you, huh? You put this one, I thought it was kind of interesting. I wasn't really following this, but the San Antonio Spurs wanted a new arena. What I think shocked me was how close this was. Very popular sports team. And to me, this is just sort of the whole, taxpayers are getting fed up with these sort of special deals. I think Paul mentioned about half of the school bond elections went down, Paul. Is that right? 56% this last time. We used to never have school bond elections go down. That never happened. And all of a sudden, you got half of them failing across the state. So to me, this is just sort of this sort of growing frustration with the tax burden, and especially when you're talking about billionaire owners and millionaire players, getting a break. So I thought that.
I think one of the things about San Antonio that we have to remember is they don't have Major League Baseball. They don't have NFL football. The Spurs is the whole thing. Yeah. And I think there are some, really virulent anti-tax voters are like, oh, well, but if it's for the Spurs.
We got some San Antonio people over here. Y'all agree with that? You also put in Senate District 9, which I was also not paying attention to, but it's obviously kind of an interesting race. Tell us what happened there.
Well, basically, you had two Republicans and a Democrat. The Democrat had no money, had very hardly any of a campaign. The two Republicans, it was kind of like we've seen in a lot of Republican primary races, although this was a special election. You have one sort of Trump wing of the party Republican, and then you have one kind of Chamber of Commerce traditional Republican. And I think it's fair to say the Trump Republican won the Republican vote by a pretty wide margin. What I was kind of surprising is with no money, no campaign, the Democrat got, 47, almost 48% of the vote. And what's interesting is this is drawn to be a Republican seat. It should be a Republican seat after the runoff, but the two Republicans that were in that didn't care for each other. And I feel like there is a certain segment of the Republican Party that is kind of an anti-Trump and the horse he rode in on, part of the Republican Party. And I don't know that they're going to vote for her. I don't know that they're going to vote for the Democrat, but they might, or they might not vote. I think it is not a foregone conclusion that this stays a Republican seat. Is Paul Betancourt still in?
Yeah, I think sure he would. I think it stays a Republican seat, but it is going to require a lot more work than you would need normally in a 60-40 Republican district. That is when Kelly Hancock, who was in the seat, but he resigned to take over as controller as part of his campaign to be the next controller. He won at 60-40 back in 2018. Kamala Harris won 41%. Donald Trump won 58%. So it's a district that should be pretty safe Republican. One thing that really hurt the Republicans here was that it was as Andy mentioned, as part of the Republican Civil War, where Lee Wamgans, Wamgans, it's a tough name to pronounce, and you just have to remember it. She had the support of Donald Trump, Dan Patrick, and others, and Huffman had the support of, say, Charlie Guerin, who's the last remaining moderate Republican from the Tarrant County House delegation, as well as Matty Parker, the mayor of Fort Worth, who's also served for the moderate wing. And what he really had to help him was Miriam Adelson, the owner of the Las Vegas Sands and the Dallas Mavericks. She gave about 85 to 90% of his campaign money. He spent about $7 million or so, $8 million. We'll have to see the final numbers. He actually did very poorly given the amount of money spent. This is going to be one for Governor Abbott. He gets to decide when this special election occurs. I think a lot more care, is going to go into, though, when you time that special election, because it's a race that normally shouldn't have been this close. And I think if we go back, retrospectively, if Taylor Rummett had actually had some money behind him and people mobilizing voters, he might have crossed that 50% threshold, and then it would be over.
So this sort of leads into the next thing I want to talk about, which was just the overall results on Tuesday. The Democrats outperformed almost every place in the country. The governor races in New Jersey and Virginia were not nearly as close as people thought they were going to be. In Pennsylvania, they had they retained their judges there, so you have a retention vote. And there were 3 progressive Supreme Court members who were a part of the group that voted to extend the mail ballot, which has just been this huge sticking point with Republicans up there. And there was a lot of money spent on it, and they got retained by, I think, about a 75% vote, as I recall. So I'm just wondering, looking at the results nationally and races like this, is this something we need to pay attention to? Is this a harbinger for the midterms, or is this just sort of local issues? Of course, Mondami won in New York, but I'm not sure what you can take away from New York. But what was your feeling after Tuesday? Mark, start with you. What was your feeling after Tuesday about is this a trend, or is it kind of one-off local stuff?
Well, so first, these are unique off-year elections, so the turnout is always going to be a little different. I think, though, if you're a Republican, though, it's a worrying sign, because you were not going to win Virginia. The last time, I think since 1977, the party of the party of the president has always lost this race, with the exception of 2013 after Obama's election in 2012. So Republicans were going to lose a seat, but losing it by 14, 15 points was not what they bargained for. And there was hope among Republicans that they would be close, if not maybe pull a surprising out in New Jersey. Once again, that was 14 or 15 points. You go out to California, it was like 60-40 in terms of Proposition 50, the redistricting referendum, which was effectively a referendum on Donald Trump. You put all that together and you see Senate District 9 here, there's an enthusiasm gap. Democrats are far more enthusiastic than Republicans. And if we go back to 2018, that was what put a lot of Texas Republicans in a very difficult position, because Democrats were able to mobilize their voters to vote against Donald Trump because he was in the White House. Republicans, though, were not able to get all of the Trump voters to mobilize and vote in those elections because Trump wasn't on the ballot. And the result was Republicans lost, I think it was a dozen seats in the Texas House. There's a dozen, 10 or 12, lost 2 U.S. House seats. That was John Culberson here, for instance, lost that seat then to Lizzie Fletcher. And people like Ted Cruz in the U.S. Senate, as well as Dan Patrick and Ken Paxton, came very close to losing. And that was when Ken Paxton was facing a completely unknown Democratic challenger who had no money and also did not yet have federal investigations for use of his office for private gain. People like Nate Paul didn't have marital infidelity 1, 2, 3, etc., and didn't have the impeachment process, didn't have all of that. So if we fast forward to 2026, at least right now, and this is still a year away, so a lot can change in a year, we'd have to assume that 2026 is going to be closer to 2018 than it is to 2024, which then also throws a bucket of cold water on any hopes of, say, somehow winning 5 additional U.S. House seats based on the mid-decade redistricting that took place in August. Best case scenario now, if this trend continues, is Republicans will have a net gain of maybe 3. But if this is the trend, if this is the way people are voting, there's no way or no realistic way that you're getting rid of Henry Cuellar down in District 28, Congressional District 28 out of Laredo, or really Vicente Gonzalez out of Congressional District 34 in Brownsville. And if you're Republicans, you probably have to start worrying a little bit about Monica de la Cruz. Her district has heavily changed. She was the one Republican who was actually hurt the most by this redistricting process, and that she has about half of her voters are completely new voters. Her district's a little less Republican. And to top it all off, she's drawn a very competitive, high-quality Democratic challenger, Bobby Pulido. If you don't like Tejano music, you probably don't know who Bobby Pulido is, but voters down in Congressional District 18, down in the border, they know who Bobby Pulido and his father are.
You know, something I noticed in the New Jersey race that was really important, I thought, were the Latino crosstabs. So in 24, and y'all tell me whether you agree with this or not, but in the 24 election, to me, the biggest difference was the Latinos left the Democratic Party en masse and voted for Republicans. There was a big change in that. It had kind of been growing for a while, but there was a real frustration with the Biden administration. You know, a lot of people think that Latinos are all in favor of immigration. Most Latinos I know are not in favor of it at all, you know. And so I think I think the Democrats missed the message there. And so there's this big switch over. But if you look at those New Jersey crosstabs, it looked like maybe there was some buyer's remorse by Latinos, which would really affect races like you're talking about down the valley. Does that sound right to y'all, or am I off on a wild goose chase there?
No, I think that's a big part of it. And it's going to be really interesting to see because a lot of the way that the Republicans redrew the districts that they redrew is they have decided that this shift in Latino voting is permanent. And maybe it is. But very few things in politics are as permanent as sometimes I think we think they are. And, you know, I'm sitting here, I'm thinking about an immigration attorney friend of mine who works a lot in East Texas, and he said that really who they need to be listening to in immigration policy is East Texans, which you don't think about that. You think about the Valley, but it's these people who have, well, you know, I'm a Republican, I'm a conservative, but, you know, man, my son-in-law, you know, needs to get his immigration fixed. And, you know, it's a lot of, it's not the guys hanging out in front of Home Depot. It's the immigration is a lot more complicated an issue than that. And I'm not sure that the Republicans or the Democrats, to be honest, are really capturing the subtlety of that.
Mark, what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, we had there's a joint poll between the University of Houston Hobby School and Texas Southern University's Barbara Jordan Public Policy Research and Survey Center. We did a poll asking people who voted for Trump in 2024, and we have their vote registered from earlier in the year, so it wasn't asking at the time. We knew how they voted, and we found that, you know, Trump's margin went from being, it was like 13% down to about 4.5% to 5%. That he still was winning, but he was losing, but he wasn't winning by as large a margin. It was much closer to his 2020 result over Biden than it was to 2024 against Harris. And the groups that he lost the most support among were Latinos and independents and younger voters, Gen Z voters. Those are the groups that had voted for him. And yeah, I think as Bill mentioned, the group that really swung in 2024 were Latino men. It was really dramatic. And I think that was a combination of not liking Biden immigration policies or Biden economic policies, not caring too much for Kamala Harris as a candidate, and liking Trump. All of that worked to give record turnout or record support among Latino men in particular for Republican candidates, and particularly for Donald Trump. That's very soft support, and it's already dissipating. And yeah, I think, as Andy was mentioning, so much of this redistricting process was built on the premise that we're going to have the same voting patterns in 2026 as we had in 2024. And that was unrealistic from the start, but it's after these results that we see between the polling and then these results, which tend to confirm the polling, it seems, you know, fanciful, really, the idea of thrive. And, you know, and in fact, if we just look at California and Texas in isolation, California Democrats are far more likely to deliver National Democrats the 5 promised Democratic seats than Republicans in Texas are to deliver the 5 promised Republican seats. If I it's an even money bet now, I would probably say Republicans' net gain is 2 to 3 seats, not 5.
You think you agree with that? Yeah. So let me just ask you the sort of the ultimate question: both of you tell me what you think the odds are of the Democrats recapturing the House in the midterms.
Mark, go first.
If I had to guess on the House, I'd give them maybe a 75-80% chance if things are like they are now. Now, of course, we still have a full year, but if we don't see a change in terms of economic trends, and it's going to be the economy that drives a lot of this. If the economy doesn't get, for instance, if the economy gets quite a bit better from where it is now, well, then those odds are going to change, because then you're going to have a groundswell of support for Republicans and Trump. On the other hand, if we had to sort of say where we are now, it's unlikely. I mean, generally presidents lose, somewhere around an average of about 15 seats in their midterm. Trump lost far more back in 2018. Given the way the districts were just redrawn in 2021 and then have been further redrawn in these mid-decade redistricting cycles, not just in Texas, but we're seeing it in Missouri, we're seeing it in North Carolina, we're seeing it in Ohio, all of those states, it's unlikely to drop, it's unlikely to be a loss in the 40s, but I would say the most likely scenario is that Hakeem Jeffries is Speaker of the House come this time next year, or really come January of 2027.
Political scientists love to look at, the historic trends and what happens to the president's party in a midterm election, and particularly like in the second midterm election by a president that served more than one term. But one of the things that kind of throws us this time is we haven't had a president serve a second but non-consecutive term since Teddy Roosevelt. And so do you measure this more like a president's first midterm election or more like a president's second midterm election? And like Mark said, a lot of it's going to have to do with the economy. But I would say maybe not 75, 80. I would say at least 60% chance the Democrats take control of the U.S. House. But I don't think they have much of a shot at the Senate at all.
No, the Senate's next to impossible. So if you look at the Senate map, Democrats, they're down 53-47. They're only the two vulnerable Republicans are the open seat in North Carolina that Tom Tillis is vacating, and Sue Collins up in Maine, who's always vulnerable because Maryland's light blue. But Democrats would have to win those two seats, and then they would have to pick up some combination of Ohio, Iowa, and Texas, which are the only other three that are even remotely in play, all while holding two very difficult seats to hold. That is an off-South seat down in Georgia and an open seat in Michigan, and then two seats that aren't locks, that is New Hampshire and Minnesota. So if you put all those odds together, it makes it very unlikely that they would get the net 4 seats that they would need to take control of the Senate. But national Republicans are still nervous about it, and that's one of the reasons why we have so much national focus on our U.S. Senate primary on the GOP side, because there's a strong belief among national Republicans that if Ken Paxton is the Republican nominee, that puts Republicans at a disadvantage compared to whether if it was, say, John Cornyn or Wesley Hunt, because he's a much easier candidate for Democrats to run a campaign against. And keep in mind, Ken Paxton has never had to run a real statewide election. He's run against Rochelle Garza, Justin Nelson, and Sam Houston. It wasn't the real Sam Houston, of course. But between those three, they didn't spend more than $1 million on the general election campaign. So you've never had a Democrat that has been able to educate voters about all the bad stuff Ken Paxton is alleged to have done. Imagine, in this case, you're not going to have that. And that's one of the reasons why so many Democrats, whether it's Colin Allred or James Tallarico or potentially Jasmine Crockett, are so interested in the U.S. Senate race, because unlike running against Greg Abbott, which is a thankless task that maybe Gina Hossa will get, but she'll get crushed, and it's just a question about how much, that Senate race, and she's not going to be able to raise any money. She's going to have to work hard and not raise it. If you run for U.S. Senate as the Democrat, the national money is just going to pour in. Because if you flip it around and say, how do Democrats take control of the U.S. Senate, it's tough for them to draw a sort of a strategy, a roadmap to take control of the U.S. Senate without winning Texas. That is, it's theoretically possible, but it's very difficult. So you're not going to have to worry about money. And so we will have that inevitable test in November 2026 if Kat Paxton, the GOP nominee, are people willing to vote for him simply because he's the Republican and because he's pursued conservative policies as Attorney General, in spite of all of the financial, ethical, marital, legal. whatever you want to say, issues that he has faced. That's one of the reasons why we're now seeing Ken Paxton suing Roblox and suing pretty much everyone, because one thing that even his detractors in the Republican Party do like is what he's done as Attorney General. That is, they agree, so you have a decent number of Republicans out there who really like how he has performed as Attorney General in terms of suing the federal government, in terms of going after local governments, in terms of all those things. They just have some issues with everything else. Especially our most recent polling shows, especially Republican-leaning women in the primary. That's a group. If the Republican primary consisted solely of women, Paxton would be in very serious trouble. If it would be consisted solely of men, he'd be looking at a cakewalk.
I see Buffy back there. I mean, every Republican women's group I talk to is like, no way, they'll have no fury. But do you both agree that if Cornyn gets a nomination, he's a lock to win? I mean, there's no way you can beat Cornyn.
I never like to say lock, but pretty close. Yeah, I think he would win pretty.
I've heard a rumor that Thune and some of these guys in the center are begging Trump to endorse Cornyn, because if Trump endorses Cornyn, he's going to get the nomination. And it'll be interesting to see whether that comes about or not.
Yeah, we had a question about that, and like 55% of Republican primary voters say they'd be much more likely to vote for someone that Trump endorsed.
Okay, the last question we're going to see, we're right at quitting time, so if anybody needs to leave, it's okay. I'm kind of used to people walking out while I'm talking, but I have this question. I'm going to take questions from the audience for you guys. Abbott says he's going to spend many millions in Harris County to turn it red. Think there's any chance Harris County turns red in 26?
Yeah, I think there's a chance. I think it's a long shot, but depending on what happens, economically and in national politics between now and then, it's a lot less blue in the last election than it was in the previous one. And I'm not saying that's a trend, but I think it is within grasping distance if certain national things happen.
Yeah, I think it all depends on national factors. If the national factors are looking good for Republicans, or at least just even, then there's a possibility. But if we have if it's more like 2018, then no real hope. I think and this is a difficulty that Texas has the earliest filing deadlines in the country. We have to file to run for office in November of 2026 by no later than December of 2025, the previous year. So people are going to have to try to predict, if you're a Republican, what are things going to be like in November of 2026? If the conditions are good, you have a chance of winning. On the other hand, if conditions are bad, we're going to see a blue sweep of every position from family law all the way up to county judge, because of just the natural tilt of the county. And once again, that's why was Lena Hidalgo county judge? Because back in 2017, no one thought it would be remotely possible to defeat Ed Emmett in the general election. So nobody except for this person with no experience, who's never held a job, who didn't really know much about Harris County at all, filed. She became the instant Democratic nominee, and then Beto did his magic, and Trump did his reverse magic, and the result was.
And she ran
county judge for 8 years.
She ran almost no campaign.
There wasn't.
I will see some questions. Yes, sir, Charles.
What about the Democratic side? The Democratic candidate would be strong enough, who would win it, to run against Paxton and Bland?
So who would be the best Democratic candidate to run against whoever emerges out of the Republican primary in the U.S. Senate race? Was the question.
I guess I can say it wouldn't be Jasmine Crockett. If I'm a Republican, the candidate that I would want to face is Jasmine Crockett. And the one reason why I think that Crockett could potentially run is only because Ken Paxton is one of the luckiest politicians in the world. So the only way the one Democrat that Paxton could defeat would be Jasmine Crockett. Other than Talarico or Allred, I mean, it's a different. Allred's the known quantity. He didn't do great, but on the other hand,
ran a terrible campaign.
Yeah, he essentially had to run in an awful year for a Democrat. Talarico's the new shiny thing, which Texas Democrats love, the new shiny thing, whether it's Beto or Wendy Davis or others. but we don't know if he'll really have the staying power or if he'll be a strong candidate. There's potential there, but then there's also potential to go.
He's got Talerico went on Joe Rogan's show. I mean, he's doing a lot of things that make sense. He's also got a voting record that would be problematic in the general election.
Just one quick thing. I think Talerico, because of his positioning, he's studying for the ministry, he would be such a dramatic contrast from Ken Paxton that I think that might be something that would keep him.
He's had a question.
As a precinct chairman, I got moved from Lizzie Fletcher to Wesley Hunt. If Wesley runs in that, as he probably will,
He is running.
he can't run for Congress as well as Senate. Is that correct? No, and so who else is going to be in that 38?
I looked at that this morning because I thought that might be something that we would talk about. And there's about 5 Republicans, 4 Democrats, or at least on the Ballotpedia page, and it's nobody that anybody's ever heard of, which is odd because that is a true red, I guess, Republican, part of town. That's a lot of, what was Bill Archer's congressional seat and all that. But I asked one of the local state representatives about that, because there was a lot of overlap with his seat. Are you interested in jumping in? And he said, hell no. And like, why? Well, number one, being a congressman is such a miserable job.
It's a terrible job.
And he had asked one of our congressional delegation, about so is it true you have to spend every morning, over at the Republican Club dialing for dollars? And he said, no, every morning and every afternoon. That's all we do. There's a quota that we have to make of money that we raise for the leadership PAC before we can start asking for money for the party, before we can start asking for money for our own campaigns. That's all we do. There's no policy making. There's no time. Which is just, I guess I'm not as surprised as I should be.
It's the same thing on the Democratic side.
But it is, yes, in fairness, it's the same thing on the Democratic side, but it is a miserable job. And I can understand, even with half a dozen well-known political entities, people in that district, state representatives and all that, none of the elected officials with any experience want to run for that.
You've seen how many people are dropping out of Congress. I mean, this,
Michael McCall,
room trial. We're gonna, yeah. Okay, we had a question here.
I've read that to some extent the government shutdown also contributed to the wins and gains by the Democrats. Can you comment on the politics of the government shutdown? Are the Republicans losing?
I've been following that really closely. And I'm surprised because there's been 14 polls, and all 14 polls have found the American people are blaming Republicans for it. And that's generally not what you see. Generally, it's the party that's sort of holding the hostages that gets blamed for it. But this time, it is clearly the Republicans. This is like by double digits in 14 different polls. I think it may have something to do with the ACA subsidy, the health insurance subsidies, which are wildly popular, and people are starting to get their bills on those right now. But it's a little bit surprising to me. Is that kind of what you...
Yeah, also I just think it's the party in control always gets the blame, whether it's their fault or not. I think that's part of it too.
How's it going to end? Is it going to if it's a government law term, or is...
Well, but as long as it ends relatively soon, it's unlikely to have an effect that bleeds over into November of 2026. There's just too much time to pass. The Thanksgiving holiday with air travel is really going to become a crunch point. That is for both sides. That is, are they willing to continue down this path? And effectively, just from a visuals perspective, that's all the coverage from social media to television and elsewhere will be of the disaster that is Thanksgiving holiday travel. I think we were probably close to an agreement until Tuesday night. I think it probably there were enough Democrats that could have been persuaded with some carrots in terms of promises to at least extend the subsidies for 1 year that they could have got there. But Tuesday night emboldened the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and so the moderate votes weren't there. It's going to take either, the two groups are going to break. A remaining group of moderate Democrats are going to break, or Donald Trump's going to change his mind. Because everything is so vertical in today's Republican Party, until Donald Trump changes his mind, the Republican Party position is a pretty easy one. They're going to continue the shutdown. He can be moved, and then there may be a half dozen or more moderate Democrats that can be moved. But it's which one gives first. It's kind of watching Footloose with Kevin Bacon on his little tractor. It's like, is someone's shoestring going to get stuck to the gears, or are they going to crash, or is somebody going to veer first?
Yeah, I think Trump will make a deal myself. He's a deal maker, and look, the polling is not good for him right now. I'm surprised how underwater he is on like inflation and the economy. It's like 20, 30 points. So he's got to do something, and I don't think he can go through Thanksgiving having a big screw up with air traffic. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to make a point about the Sci-Fair school board.
Well, tell them who you are, first of all, so you'll know. Yeah.
My name is
So
Deborah.
they'll know you have some authority to speak on this.
I do have some authority to speak on it. My husband was a candidate, and
And your name, his name, and your...
it's George Edwards
Yep.
Jr. CPA.
Yep.
And the issue in Sci-Fair, it's an anomaly. Sci-Fair is a conservative area, and it will remain conservative. The conservatives voted against the chaos and the instability on the school board. Not that they were voting for Democrats. They voted against that. And on our ticket, we had a chaotic candidate that none of us found out about until it was too late. So that was a lesson learned, and like I said, it was an anomaly, and we don't ever foresee it happening again.
But it gets back to the old adage that all politics are local, right? See, somebody else over here had a... Yes, yeah, Mike.
Feels like you, Michael Huffmaster. I think I've heard some words that describe the dysfunctional two-party system. And some in this room have advocated for an independent or moderate party. What's your assessment of a prospect of a moderate party emerging given the chaos and dysfunction we see today?
I think y'all know what I think about this.
Yeah, I've tried so hard to be a disciple of Bill's on this because I want to believe it. The way that our system is set up, it's so hard. It's so hard for it to emerge. I kept thinking, even so, surely we're close to a point where there's so many people in the middle that are fed up that we'll reach a critical mass, and we keep somehow not reaching it. So.
Little to none. Where the system is set up to maintain the current two-party system. People identify as Republicans and Democrats. That's a natural starting point for anyone. Also, our party systems, our primary system compared to primary systems everywhere else in the world, are very permeable. Anyone can run as a Republican or anyone can run as a Democrat. Therefore, if you are an entrepreneurial politician or ambitious politician, it makes a lot more sense to run as a Democrat or a Republican than as a third party. Say, for instance, take the case of running as a Democratic Socialist, as a new party, or running as a Working Families Party candidate. That's not going to do you much good. On the other hand, if you run as the Democrat in their primary, you win it, then you have the D next to your name. And I think, I always go back to, 2020 with Michael Bloomberg. So Michael Bloomberg has the profile, if you're going to have a sort of moderate centrist candidate, moderate Republican, former mayor, independently wealthy, wouldn't have to worry about raising a dime. He and his people studied the issue very diligently and came to the conclusion that his only hope and prospect was running a long shot bid within the Democratic primary. Yeah, I think that's someone who had all of the resources to study every angle, and he came to that conclusion.
So the only time this has ever happened was in the 1850s when the Republican Party got started, and there was a galvanizing issue of slavery around that. Whether or not government dysfunction will ever be that kind of galvanizing issue or not, I don't know. But I tell you what, I've sort of given up on this for the last year or so. I've gotten more calls in the last month saying, what happened to that? Don't we need to do that? I think at some point in time there could be enough pressure for it to happen, but and I don't think it's as hard to do as they do after studying it. But all of these third-party bids that start with a presidential candidate is a mistake. Okay, you can't start at the top. You got to start at the grassroots. What Republicans did in the 1850s was they started electing candidates at the local level. Lincoln wasn't even in the Republican Party when it got started. He was still a Whig. all you did, they were going to be spoilers. Don't let them, don't follow those guys. He finally moved over. They ran somebody else for president in 1856. I don't remember who it was now. But when he ran for president in 1860, there were already 90 Republican members of Congress. And in that election, it was a four-way race. He won the Electoral College outright with 38% of the vote. So the math is possible, but there are a lot of structural impediments that have been put in by the two parties. Hamlin?
I would say therefore it's the approach to an election, particularly the candidates, it should have ranked choice. Notice it's that opposite cooperative.
Now, I like ranked choice voting, but the Republican Party has decided it's some kind of a fraud, and so it's certainly never going to happen in Texas under the current regime. But it just makes sense to me because it saves money. You don't do these stupid runoff elections where nobody shows up. If we had ranked choice voting, I'd probably be mayor of Houston.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think, and one thing related to that, there is the top two alternative, which is what California, Washington State use, and then Alaska uses top four, and then ranked choice voting. That, in theory, should encourage some moderation, because the idea is that in a blue district you get two Democrats, but then there'd be an incentive for the one Democrat to appeal to Republicans, and thus it would moderate things. The evidence we have in California and Washington State is that it hasn't seemed to have done that much, but that's the principal institutional method. Now, the Texas Republican Party, of course, is going completely in the opposite direction with its attempt to try to close primaries. Now, they can't do it because we don't have partisan registration in Texas, meaning there's no way to determine who's a Republican. In every state that has that type of closed primaries, that's closed to people who are members of the party, they all have partisan registration. So the only way for Texas to legitimately and realistically do it is to require everybody to re-register. And when they register as a Republican, Democrat, Independent, or some other party. That's not in the cards right now, although our Attorney General refuses to defend the current Texas election law, so it's up to the Secretary of State, Jane Nelson, to do so.
You would just think that you've already discussed the ability for candidates to run legal. You've already put that in creative style. It's coupled, they can all make ranked choice voting. Seeing, I'm not happy with both sides to it. But those two effectively change the way they.
And there's a ranked choice voting group that lobbies and goes up, and they can't even get in anybody's office to talk about it in Austin.
Stronghold.
It was funny. I was arguing with my Republican friends who wanted to close their primary. I said, you start paying for your primary, you can close it. I mean, we literally spend millions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, running primary elections. They want to say, well, this is a private association. Well, it's a private association. Then why are we giving you all this money to run your primary election? They didn't have a really good answer to that. Akira.
So either Amanda Edwards or Christian Menefee is going to represent the Congressional District 18, but not for very long. Now, you raised the interesting question as to whether one of those candidates, whoever gets elected, might shift over and run against Sylvia Garcia. How would you rate the chance of either one of those candidates beating Sylvia Garcia? Should she be worried?
It's much better than defeating Al Green in Congressional District 18 because I can see a viable pathway there. Now, that's a race that you already have Jarvis Johnson, who's indicated he's interested in it. So it's one that may go to a runoff. But the advantage you have in that district is, one, it's only about 40% of it are people who Garcia is currently representing. And the second, it's just the dominance, or at least of African Americans in the Democratic primary. Latinos are going to be split between those who don't participate, those who go in the Republican primary, and those who go in the Democratic primary. So they're going to be the smaller group. It's a much more winnable race than, say, running against Al Green. I would still say Garcia would be the favorite simply because she has incumbency status and she's likely to enjoy the support of a lot of different groups. And it's going to be tough for whoever runs against her to raise much money. But, the pathway there is, I think, is open. If Al Green runs, the only thing you have to, it would be mortality that you would have to hope works in your favor, not the actual voters, because, you can criticize Al Green, and a lot of people will say it's time for you to step aside, like Lloyd Doggett did up in Travis County, but it's a very different situation. Lloyd, in Travis County, you had Greg Casar, a very popular former Austin City Council person who had been in Congress and who was sort of part of the new progressive wing there. He has been like a stronger case that there are two of us here, only one of us can stay. I have a better argument to stay. That's going to be much more trouble for somebody who has never served a day in Congress, because even if Ed Edwards and Christian Menifee are elected, by the time they get seated, we'll be at about primary day in March.
All right, okay, one more, I'm going to cut off. He's asking about Supreme Court and tariffs is what you have.
I ask if you have any. I was curious if you had any opinion on the Supreme Court weighing in on the tariff decision and if that could have any impact on the midterm elections. Also, regarding the Senate, I wouldn't discount Ohio if Sherrod Brown can just be pushed back out onto the stage.
Yeah, it was interesting, yeah. I, being the only lawyer up here, I'll talk about the tariffs. I listened to a fair amount of Supreme Court argument, and they were not having any of Trump's lawyers' arguments. They were really pushing back hard.
Even the conservatives.
Yeah. I mean, I would guess that it's going to be probably at least a 7-2 decision against Trump on some level. Now, I think if I heard Amy Coney Barrett, what she was searching for, is there some way to rein this back without just blowing up the whole thing? And so maybe they'll figure out something like that. But it was pretty, and frankly, almost all the lawyers I know, and from me reading the statute, I just don't see how you can possibly get to the kind of tariff power he claims under that statute. Now, there's other statutes that he could use, but I think there's going to be some significant limitation or overturning of it. I'm not sure what the remedy is going to be, but that's my reading on it. And frankly, it probably helped the Republicans if it went away, because the tariffs are very unpopular in the polling. Yeah. So I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and cut it off here. I appreciate everybody coming today and staying for so long. And listen to great. How many of you think we ought to do this again, like every 6 months? Is that everybody enjoy this? Okay. And I'm going to send out a little survey to everybody that came today and ask you about what do y'all think about this venue compared to the ones that were here? More constant? Yeah. Okay. All right. Sounds good. Well, thank you all for coming. I'll be back signing some books, and then you'll be getting a blog from me pretty soon.
Yes, I think.